welcome to a special EWTN on-location bookmark from Washington, D.C., from the studios of EWTN News Nightly with Colleen, Carroll, Campbell. I'm Doug Keck here again with Colleen, Carroll, Campbell. And if you got a chance to see us last week, you know we started a discussion about the program and about the New Faithful, the first book you had written about 10 years ago. And we started talking about her new book, which is My Sisters, the Saints, a spiritual memoir. And that's really the book that we want to talk about and focus on this particular program. I see there's a very nice little emblem, looks like an award from the Christophers.
Yes,
you got for that book then?
Yeah, My Sisters the Saints won an award from the Christophers, which was a real honor, and it won an Association of Catholic Publishers award as well.
So you're lighting candles everywhere, right? You're not cursing the darkness, as
right,
they would
exactly.
say, right? Now, you dedicated this, it's all about women, but you dedicated it to a man named John.
That's right.
With admiration for all you are, gratitude for all you do, and love with all my heart. Now, how did your husband feel about that?
He loved it. Yeah, he didn't mind at all. He's not the kind who gets embarrassed by, you know, mushy dedications. So he liked it, and I meant every word. He's a phenomenal man.
Right, and in the book later, you talk about the fact that he played a central part to your ability to do it, and even was kind of read everything and bounced ideas back and forth off of you, right?
Absolutely. That's the kind of guy he is, and he's been that way on everything, including this show, just encouraging me and making some big sacrifices so we could move out here and I could do this.
Right, exactly. And one of the things that struck me in the contents, there's basically broken up into 6 chapters, but the first one is says Party Girl, and I have to admit it was kind of like, whoa, okay, is it really? And it's interesting to read, and let's talk about that in a second. But you say, this is a story of a journey. This is your note to the reader. A personal search for insight and peace that began with that age-old, seductively simple question, is this all there is? And I always said it was an old Peggy Lee song called Is That All There Is, which was that same kind of idea. And when did that come to you? Did that come to you in that college day after the party, the morning after you described here? That's really when you've had that feeling?
It is. I mean, I would say it was a process. My Sisters the Saints covers a 15-year period, and you know, that question would come bubbling up at different times. But that was really when it hit me with the most force. You know, I was kind of doing the work hard, play hard college thing at a Catholic university, checking my box on Sunday, you know, with the half-hour drive-through Mass, usually 15 minutes
I was
late.
Ask you, what's a half-hour? Where could you go to drive-through Mass?
Well, this is Marquette University, at
Did
least
they
when
actually
I
have a
was
drive-through
there.
Mass,
Well, no, but that was what we called it.
But it was so quick,
and
right?
you know, I should give the priest credit. He was trying to do something so that we'd get there, you know, and the slackers would at least get there, you know. And it was 6 p.m., so you couldn't oversleep it. And you know, I still showed up late quite often.
Was that Sunday night then?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
I noticed a lot of colleges will do it at Sunday night.
Yeah. Oh, there was a 10 p.m. There were plenty of them, and I think it's great to offer it. But there was certainly a sense, for me at least, of just checking the box, doing the bare minimum at that point. My faith had been very important to me growing up. I grew up in a devout Catholic home, but by the time I was in college, I was all about, you know, building resumes, social scene, you know, having a good time, making sure I was prepared to get a good job, and just God kind of got put on the back burner. Well,
you kind of say that you kind of experienced the gulf between the boisterous party scene that had once captivated me and the menacing emptiness that consumed me in quieter moments. How did you see yourself, though, in relation to, even in your story here? I mean, you might have been a party girl compared to where you are now, but compared to most other people who were there, you were, you know, your dorm mates or whatever, you probably weren't quite as
Are you accusing me of being boring?
No, I'm just saying.
It's an inflated sense of my own wildness.
No, my point being, I guess, is the fact that even a person like yourself who doesn't go all the way out there, because you make it clear that you didn't go, let's say, all the way out there per se, it was easy to drift.
Yeah.
And it wasn't a conscious decision to walk away. You just kind of floated away, right?
Right, and I never stopped going to Mass. I was doing my service projects at least once a week.
Yeah, I was very impressed. I mean, you're going to a soup kitchen and some other stuff, right?
Yeah, and I was following what I'd been taught were the really big rules and the really big no-nos in Catholicism. But there were so many other ways in which I wasn't living the spirit of the faith. I wasn't striving to grow closer to God or more holy. I was just trying to keep it, you know, barely within the lines, and then otherwise do whatever I wanted. And so, you know, were there people worse than me? Certainly. Were there ones better than me? Of course. But I think I was kind of, in some ways, you know, your typical Catholic college student, where, you know, it's not that you've rejected the faith. You just you feel like you have other things that are more important, your GPA, your resume, whatever.
Is that a phase that you think young people go through anyway?
I do think it's true, but I also think the atmosphere of the church in the last 40 years has made it more difficult sometimes for young people. You know, I was well catechized in my home. I knew the faith better than most simply because my parents knew it and taught it to me.
And you talk a lot about your dad, and especially your dad, but also your mom in the book, right?
Right, so I was blessed that way, but even so, the atmosphere was a little bit go along to get along, and not just, you know, in my certain circle, but just generally. That's kind of, you know, it's almost considered you can be anything on a college campus today, but don't be too devout, don't be a nut about it.
Right.
You know?
Well, you even tell a story when you finally broke up with a young man, right? Where rather than, it was better to be known as somebody who was stuck up and wasn't interested in somebody than it was to be that you were too devout and didn't think he was a good match from a religious perspective.
Right, exactly. I mean, I was, you know, as I recount in the first chapter of the book, I kind of had this phase, and then I had this sort of, what's this all about, began searching, but I kept that search completely under wraps, at least while I was in college. So even in my...
For fear of being ostracized?
I just didn't want to, I think it was almost like, it's embarrassing to be getting too into your faith. I was even in a faith sharing group, and that was okay one night a week, but it was kind of weird that I started sneaking off to daily mass and I started reading books about, you know, saints who died 400 years ago, that kind of thing. I think I just thought was maybe embarrassing, and even among friends who shared the faith, I just didn't feel that part of my life I could be as open about. And for all I know, some of them were searching in similar ways, but I think there is, sometimes as Catholics we have this sense we can't talk too openly about Jesus or we'll act like nuts, and you know, it's unfortunate because there's nothing in Catholicism that says we need to be that way.
I think I grew up in New York, and they always used to talk about it like as the Irish church, because it was suppressed, that people's religion was always a private kind of thing because it wasn't allowed to be openly practiced. And you had and there was also this sense of fitting in and not wanting to be different and wanting to be an American and not do anything that makes one look out of the ordinary or different than the average American, so to speak. You know?
Right.
You know, and so that's what's nice, quite honestly, many times of being in Birmingham with EWTN is that the Baptists are very open about their faith, and many times it makes it a lot easier. You know, one of the things you said here in the very beginning was our unfettered freedom just a trap in disguise?
Yes, this was, well, shortly after I had this sort of wake-up moment, you know, and kind of looking around me at the detritus of the party scene and my own sense that this isn't making me happy anymore and it's not fulfilling, was I began to wonder about a lot of the messages I had just imbibed throughout my childhood and growing up. Again, not so much from my parents, but just from the culture of, you know, the women's liberation movement, you know, what it is to be fulfilled and free as a woman. It's all about you. It's all about, you know, striving and not letting anyone stand in your way and you know, chasing pleasure and success with abandon, and you don't worry a lot about commitments to others or to God. And, you know, I wouldn't have maybe embraced it quite that iteration of it, but that was generally what we were kind of
And you also went out of your way actually to take some courses, right? Didn't you actually?
Yeah. So
and you kind of thought the early versions were pretty good, but then it started getting a little weird.
That's right. So when I started asking these questions, I thought, well, I should study more on the women's movement, and I was very open to it, and I liked the early feminists. You know, hey, women ought to get paid the same for doing the same job, or women ought to be able to vote, for goodness sakes. And, you know, the early stuff was pretty palatable, I think, to anyone.
In fact, many of them were against abortion and things like that.
In fact, they were.
Or birth control.
Yeah, the early American feminists were almost uniformly so. They thought abortion was an affront to a woman's dignity. It was a way for a man to get out of taking responsibility. But as we got into the later writings and the more radical feminists, I was taken aback because their view of men, motherhood, and God was so foreign to my experience. I mean, here with a father who had been such a loving, strong figure in my life, to read that most men are just out to use you and abuse you, and, you know, it just didn't comport with my experience. And so there are a lot of different versions of feminism. I'm probably citing the more radical ones, but in the end, I just...
patriarchy group, as
the Blame It on Patriarchy, as a friend of mine and I used to say as we walked out of class each day. But in the end, I thought, this isn't where I'm going to find the answers, because it was kind of all materialistic anyway. It was all about here and now and getting what's due to me. And that really was what I had already been kind of focused on.
Had
I
you
wanted
already
something
started to
else.
experience the idea, because you were fairly successful in the sense you did well in school, you got awards and all these kinds of things like that. You were the editor of the paper, right, and stuff?
The magazine and yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
and where were you at Marquette? Where were you?
Marquette,
Marquette
yeah.
at the time, right. And did you grow up in Colorado? Where did you grow up?
I grew up, I
of
moved
places?
around, but I went to high school in Colorado.
Okay, that's
yeah.
what I remember in the book, and then you went to Marquette. So you were fairly successful. So did you have part of that sense also that you achieve this goal and it's nice, but there's got to be something more? And because sometimes that happens with people who are lucky enough, to some degree, it can cut both ways, of achieving what they want and realize it's not quite what they were thinking was going to fulfill them.
Exactly.
And if they're lucky, they turn towards God. If they're not, they turn towards desolation and other things.
Right, that's exactly right. I think I thought, well, if you look at me on paper, I've got what I thought I wanted. I've got what the world tells me is going to make me happy. And I've never felt this empty in my life, just this hollow, kind of gnawing feeling in my gut, like something is really wrong here. And I began to say, I began to connect it through some experiences I relate in my Sisters of the Saints, namely one after Mass, after that drive-through Mass I referred to
right.
in our prior discussion, that maybe this has something to do with the fact that I've been basically ignoring God for 4 years.
This is life without God. That's what came to you, right?
That's right, and I that kind of hit me. That emptiness hit me in a profound way. One night, the fall of my senior year, after I'd gone to this Mass, I was so late I missed most of it. I could hardly see. I'm with a boyfriend who's chattering in my ear like, "Oh, let's get out of here," and I just thought, "Oh my gosh, this is what it." Like, it really does make a difference if you have a relationship or not, in this most visceral way of how you feel. I mean, that kind of sense of peace you either have or you don't, and I've at least never known it without God.
Right, okay. And you say, I had opened the door to God, the next move was His. Now, my impression is, did he move that quickly, or did he move as quickly as you thought he was going to move?
No, God usually likes to make me wait. I'm naturally impatient, and he's been spending decades trying to teach me to overcome that. He hasn't succeeded yet. But no, I kind of thought, well, here I am. Okay, I've noticed you. Now what? And there was no thunderbolt.
Right.
But there began to be some things that happened. And in fact, I went home for that Christmas break.
Dad gave you the book, right?
My father, my parents had just moved to St. Louis, didn't know a soul. I was so bored, I started going to daily Mass with my dad, and he gave me this book, Marcelo Claire's Teresa of Avila biography. Old book. Had been written, I don't know, 40-some years ago, and I thought, oh, great, here's another book from Dad for a Christmas present. But one night, I was just bored and started reading it, and I was immediately captivated by this woman who was fiery, feisty, as liberated as any secular feminist I'd ever seen, but also passionately in love with God. And what I liked so much about her is she was nearly 40 by the time she sort of got her act together spiritually. So she wasn't a plaster of Paris saint. She was an earthy, real woman with flaws and struggles.
She was
And
a
I
party
could
girl,
relate.
too, according to you, right?
She was. She even
With the
in
gift
the
of
convent.
gab and no
Yes.
shortage of male admirers, right?
And even within the convent, because the convents in those days, the Carmelite convents, and I'm speaking, of course, of Teresa of Avila, the great reformer of the Carmelite order. But before she was a reformer, she was a lax nun herself, kind of visiting with guys in the parlor and, socialite, talking, chitter-chattering. They could have pets in their rooms, the rich ones. It was like a little social club, a sort of a sorority house. It wasn't like the convents we picture now. But she gradually had this conversion, then it dawned on her that, God deserved more of her than this, and she was miserable giving him just a part of herself.
Life, right. Yeah, through her struggles, Teresa discovered the wisdom of the Catholic teaching that our bodies and what we do with them matter. And battling critics both inside and outside her order, Teresa refused to back down her quest to transform her Carmelite convents from havens for spoiled socialites to places of genuine simplicity and prayer.
That's right, and she endured incredible obstacles in doing that, physical obstacles and frightening political battles and all the rest of it. And she just persevered with the kind of strength that we rarely see of women or men today on the secular stage, and that impressed me. So it was the first time I think I related to a saint on an adult level. I'd read little books about the saints
St.
as a
Rosalina
child.
was your favorite when you were a kid.
Right, but it was kind of because I thought the name was pretty. Later I learned she had a lot more to her than a pretty name, but at the time it was a pretty superficial reason that I chose her for confirmation. But Teresa of Avila, I thought, wow, I mean, she's strong, she's smart, she's liberated, And she's single-minded for Jesus, not just for herself. That's somebody I'd like to emulate.
Right. You said Teresa's ardent faith had not squelched her natural boldness and originality, but purified and intensified both, which is something for yourself as well, right?
That's right. You know, I have a rather intense personality in terms of when I, you know, set after a goal, I really want to achieve it, and you know, I'm outspoken on a lot of things that I believe in. And in Teresa, I saw someone who took those gifts and put them in the service of God instead of just, you know, aggrandizing herself or some other more mundane cause.
Right. In chapter 2, a child again, when I first looked there, I'm thinking to myself, well, you were feeling like a child again, or maybe this is when you're going to have children, but it wasn't. You said Mom was on the line. She had taken my father to see the doctor about his forgetfulness. The news was not good. He had Alzheimer's.
That's right. So I got that call when I returned after I had this sort of invigorating Christmas break, resolved to break up with the boyfriend who wasn't really leading me toward God. And I got this call almost immediately when I got back to school that my father had Alzheimer's. He'd been forgetful for a while. He was older than my mom. And so, you know, we just thought it was
like 11 or 12 years older?
11 years older. And we
right.
just thought, you know, Dad's kind of just, you know, oh, that's Dad. He doesn't pay much attention. But, you know, so that hit me like a bombshell. I didn't really understand at the time all the implications, and maybe it's best I didn't at 21. But I knew enough to turn to God and say, okay, now I'm paying attention to you, and this is the first thing that I get thrown at me. And in the sense, not so much it's all about me, but just, wow, like I thought things were going to just be easy breezy from here on out. And of
Health
course,
and wealth gospel.
Exactly.
Isn't that how it works?
Exactly. Not so much.
Right.
But that began this you know, journey, and it was a long journey of his through Alzheimer's and of mine, and of course my mother and my family in accompanying him
It
through that.
encompasses everybody. I mean, it really changes everything.
Yes.
And you go through all the layers as you talk about the levels of care and what you can do, and when you're in situations where you can't control how he's taken care of because you can't take care of him yourself, and nobody's going to take care of him as well as you want him taken care of.
Exactly.
And people tend to think many times, though they tend to disappear almost in front of you as a personality, they're a lot more cognizant than a lot of people think they are.
They are, and emotionally, at least in my father's case, he was more intuitive in a sense than he'd ever been. But first I had to get through those early stages of learning how to deal with a father who could no longer be the guy I brought my problem to and he'd give me some pearl of wisdom. He would give me those pearls, but they would be a little mangled, and they would be, you know, he had a way of cutting to the heart of something because he was so much operating by faith, especially as he moved deeper into that disease and was more stripped of his worldly achievements and brilliance. And it came down to really just him clinging for dear life to his faith. And I saw that, and it profoundly impacted me. But at first, it was very difficult just to deal with the story that's repeated 800 times of the, how many times are you going to ask me what I did today? You know, all of that, especially when you're, you know, you're 21, 22, and you want everything fast. And the saint who really helped me with that was Teresa of Lisieux. I was surprised that this saint, who had been a favorite of my father's for years, and I always thought she seemed kind of simpering and a little too goody two-shoes to relate to. But I started to read about her, read her autobiography, but also about her life. And her father had experienced dementia after a stroke. And she had gone through this same sort of crucible that was laying in front of me. And her father had gone through that. And as I read about her little way and the way that she looked at her father, it wasn't as a victim, it wasn't as an embarrassment, it wasn't as just a tragedy with no upside. For Therese, she recognized the pain, called it a great humiliation and one of the deepest sorrows of her life, but she also said, I see him becoming conformed more and more to the crucified Christ, and for that, you know, I can learn from him. I'm grateful. And that made me look at my own father in a new light.
Right. Under signs of decline, you say, perhaps most important, I identify with Teresa's tender and trying relationship with her father.
Yeah. I mean, and that's what Alzheimer's is for anyone who has a loved one with this. You know, when you really get involved and stay involved, you see that they have so much to give us. So much that's hard to quantify in a culture that says it's all about rationality and autonomy and productivity. They call us to the present moment, to relying on God, you know, moment to moment for literally everything, and giving up a lot of the pretense of being in control because they can't pretend they are. But really, at the end of the day, who of us can?
Right, and ultimately they're stripped bare like Christ on the cross. I mean, basically is where you are. I know my father-in-law, when he died, and my mother-in-law, who had Alzheimer's as well, we could kind of see that. And you talk about that time, was it the trip to Ireland?
Yes.
which didn't go so well. Page 43, you're talking, I found myself alone in a chilly hotel room, scribbling tear-stained notes in my journals. I tried to make sense of what I had witnessed that week. And in it you say, a father who keeps slipping further and further into the past before my existence where I don't even matter.
And so many of the stories he told and his memories, it was all in that direction. And yet he had this joy, this irrepressible joy. And it seemed to come from somewhere that the plaques and tangles of Alzheimer's couldn't reach. And that became magnified more as the years went on. But it takes a certain way of looking at it. And I didn't have that at first, and it was St. Therese and, of course, my Catholic faith that gradually helped me look at him and start to see these sparks of grace.
Now, your dad had been somebody who was successful and then had given that up to be like to do charity work and
That's
be
right.
a chaplain at a hospital.
Right.
And he also read, you talk about in the early days, your mother, and he would read the lives of the saints and go. So was there some sort of inner resource he had there maybe during those times?
He did. He was, you know, blessed in the sense that he had this profound faith. He was a very learned man, especially about the faith. You know, he would read John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, and, you know, he and my mom would stay up late talking about them. You know, he got to a point in his disease where all he could read were children's lives of the saints, and he would read the same page over and over. He couldn't make sense of them. But he did have that deep inner resource. Adoration, Eucharistic adoration, was still a part of his life every day. My mother and he would go to the chapel together, and I would watch him, and he knew who was there. You know, so he stayed. That part of him never faded, even as the intellect faded, and even as the, you know, all the knowledge he once had faded away. That rock solid faith in God never faded. And his favorite phrase, we're all in God's hands. That's the way he answered every day that I'd ask how he is. And he meant it.
My discovery of Therese in her little way not only changed the way I looked at Dad, it changed how I looked at millions of others like him, the demented and disabled, the infirm, the frail, the elderly, and the unborn. Isn't that what the lesson is for us to realize?
Absolutely.
And to see the beauty in that. And, you know, you talk also the idea of redemptive suffering, which you saw in that as well, right?
That's right. And you know, I was kind of a little wishy-washy on the life issues. Even at this point, after rediscovering my faith, I was still figuring out all those things. It was my experience of journeying with Dad through this that helped me really embrace the pro-life cause as a personal cause, as a cause that's about the dignity of every person, and to realize that these people that we're casting off to the margins and saying they don't count, I think if we could see things the way God sees them, in some ways they count the most. And they're the ones who have the most to teach us. They might be the ones who are staying God's hand in terms of the mercy on this world, and we don't recognize them, because that's the Christian way, where the greatest things are often hidden under the most humble disguise. The Eucharist is an example.
Well, I believe, don't you have a story, was it about St. Patrick's Day? Is it in,
That's
was
right.
that in St. Louis
Yes,
or something, where you're not supposed to throw beads or whatever, sort of
And
like Mardi
course,
Gras
you know,
in the way
Dad
they do
didn't
it?
understand. So he loved, you know, his parents were Irish immigrants. He was all Irish.
This is a great picture of him. He's got an Irish face.
Yeah, he
He had
does.
an Irish face.
Yeah, he loved St. Pat's, and so we were riding on the parade float, and you're not supposed to throw the beads. So, of course, the police, when they aren't looking, people throw, but not Dad. You know, he waits till the cop is looking right at him, throws it right at, twirls him as a lasso, throws him right at the police officer. You know, and then the crowd's chanting beads, beads, and he leans over and goes, I don't know who this Steve guy is. Steve.
Oh, right,
So he was just a character. But I remember that day because he got off the float, and he could barely steady himself. And he turned to me 5 minutes later, and he had no idea he'd ever been in this parade, in the center of this parade. And that was the day I remember realizing that's why in my own throwing of the beads, I kept looking for the child with Down syndrome, or the elderly person kind of shunted to the side, or someone on the margins. I hadn't been that aware of those folks before, and it was Dad who made me aware of them. So he gave me so many gifts that through his suffering, I was able to learn.
Right. In some ways, by having that, you start to see these people are all around you, and to some degree, you just didn't see them.
Yeah.
Now, there's so much more in this book. You end up going to Washington to work for President Bush as the only female speechwriter, right?
That's right.
You had some interesting experiences there. Word chauvinist was used in the book, which I hadn't seen.
Not for President Bush.
Not for President Bush, but for, I guess, some of your other cohorts there and things. And that must have been tough, and people can learn all about that. And you've got stuff about learning to trust with St. Faustina, of course, and you've also got a whole section here is beautiful talk about Mary and how you turn to her, and of course issues that we'll talk about with children and other things and decisions you had to make in your life.
Yeah,
and
infertility was a long struggle that my husband and I went through, and it's one of the main themes of the book is both Alzheimer's and infertility.
And it was important for you to be honest, right? Did it take you to work through that?
Yes,
it
did.
There?
My resolution was to follow my husband's advice. Just write everything completely honestly as if no one's ever going to read it. And, then, and I did it, and then in the end I thought, well, I guess I got to let people read it. So.
Right. Well, that's the way you impact people, just like your dad being out
Right.
there, right? That's how you impact people. Well, thank you so much, Colleen.
Thanks for
and
having
good luck
me,
with the
Doug.
show, huh?
Thank you.
We'll look forward to more programs coming forward here
excited.
for EWTN News Nightly with Colleen Carroll Campbell. But we're talking to her as an author of this latest book, very popular book, My Sisters the Saints, a spiritual memoir. It's published by Image, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. I know a lot of people reading it. It's very popular. They like it. Check it out. And check us out next time right here on EWTN's Bookmark. We're on location. Thanks for joining us.